doing today? We are going to be doing something very exciting that I think you guys will find very interesting, which is making a radial rosette. I'm going to be putting this walnut material into this top here. This top is for a student in my upcoming hands-on guitar build workshop, which, by the way, real quick, let me just say that there's only one spot left in this upcoming workshop. It goes from March 8th to the 16th. There's one spot left, and I just this morning put out an email letting my email list know that because it's so close to that date and I really don't like to have an unfilled spot, that's just, you know, losing money for myself. I'm giving you guys a special opportunity, which is if you want to snag this spot in this upcoming workshop, if you can make this work, if you can take a 9-day vacation real quick from your job, or perhaps you're retired, jump in on this spot and I will give you $300 off of the spot. So there you have it. Hell of a deal. 300 bucks is a lot of money that you can put towards parts and tools and things for your next guitar after the workshop. That's March 8th through 16th. Okay, so what we're doing, again, like I said, we are putting a rosette. Where did I, oh, it's right here. Where did I put that material? We are putting this walnut into the rosette. You can see that this strip is cut so that the grain runs cross grain, right? It runs along the width of the strip. That's very important because what we're gonna do is cut this into little wedges all the way across and then reassemble it so that all of the grain points radially in towards the center of the sound hole. So I'm going to be using the Radial Rosette Maker jig to do this. This is a jig that I produce personally here in the shop in Burnville, Pennsylvania. You can order this jig from my website, but hey, let me just say right off the bat, you can do this without this jig. You just need a piece of scrap wood, a sacrificial piece of wood that you're going to essentially assemble and stick these down to. It's going to take a lot more time because you won't have the circle clamp here that you'll see that I'm using, and you won't have this template here to cut out the wedges very accurately and quickly. And you know, you just have to essentially draw out this pattern that I have here on the jig. You have to do that onto your scrap board. It's not terribly hard to do. Again, it's just, it takes time and you're sacrificing a board that you have to sort of remake every single time you do this again. So the reason I came up with this jig, I did this for myself actually. There wasn't a thought in my mind that I would make a product, but I was doing a lot of radial rosettes at the time. I still do a lot of them, and I wanted something that I could just go to, a station to knock these out, where I wasn't reinventing the wheel every single time, so to speak. So anyway, Radial Rosette Maker jig, that's what it's all about. Okay, and like I said, we're going to be using this cross grain material right here. This comes from, by the way, very easy way to get your material. Hey, you want your rosette likely to match some other part of your guitar, so you can steal this right from the back. And you can see that when this was a larger piece, this came from, it looks like, right up here. So if you have excess back material, which most of the time you should, go ahead and cut a nice long strip, maybe 2 strips. I've got some extras here because sometimes I do need a little bit more, right? So here's another back, just to give you an example. This one actually is too shy to get the material out of. You can see I can't really get a wide enough strip. I like to cut these at about 2 inches. I don't actually need them to be that wide, but that gives me some wiggle room as far as the aesthetically how big I want that rosette to be, right? I usually want it to be quite a bit smaller than 2 inches, but hey, I have that wiggle room. I can make that decision after I've assembled all the pieces. But a piece like this, you can still steal some small pieces of cross grain material from the waist or from the edges if you need to. There's lots of scrap, lots of ways to do this. Perhaps your head plate, you'll have some extra material wherever you're sourcing your head plate from as well. but cross grain about 2 inches, and the thickness, I usually like to be about 1/8 of an inch. This is definitely thicker than an eighth of an inch, but I'm gonna sand this a little bit to clean it up. In fact, I'll do that right now, and it'll be a little bit closer to 1/8 of an inch then, but not super critical. This is probably 160 thousandths of an inch, and that'll work as well. That's probably good. All right, so let me just give you the basic rundown of what we're gonna do. First, we're gonna place this strip under our wedge here and cut out, we're gonna line it with the center line and then cut out all of the individual pieces that we need. That will be 12 pieces to give us a full circle. And then after that, we can take the scrap block out of there and assemble all 12 of those pieces underneath the circle clamp and tighten that down and run a bead of water-thin CA glue between each piece to glue it all together. And then with the circle clamp held down tight to the piece, we can place a Dremel with a circle cutting jig right on this pin right here and cut out our rosette, then finally installing the rosette into the soundboard material. So we're starting right here with the wedge template. I'm going to place some scrap block underneath so I can cut into it. And the first thing I'm going to do is take my long strip here and just line up the center line of the jig with my grain. And here the grain kind of shifts as I go, so I might have to redo this a couple times to follow that grain pattern. But also, you don't have to line it up perfectly with the grain, is a good point I want to mention out. Actually, I was answering this question in an email recently because someone was having trouble lining it up with each grain line as they went, and I made the point that this is just aesthetic. This is art here. So I usually actually let it drift off of perfect throughout the cutting process, as you'll see here. I don't want it to be a perfectly oriented piece because there's really a sort of naturally beautiful effect that you get if you let it drift a little bit off of perfect center. But to start here for this first piece that I'm going to cut out, I'm going to go ahead and line it up right on the grain. And then I just tighten these down. Don't over tighten it. It is possible to, if you just keep going, this will continue to flex and flex, and it's already holding it down as tight as it can. And if you just keep going, I mean, I've never really seen it happen, but you could, in theory, break the wedge there. All right, let's grab some saws here and we'll talk about a few things. So you can use a Dazuki saw like this. So this is just a very thin curved saw that does not have a set to the teeth. That works great, but actually I have found that I prefer to use this little Japanese curved edge mini saw. I think it's called something like that. I got this off of Stu Mac a long time ago and I've been thoroughly impressed with it. I'm sure you can find it elsewhere as well, but the simple idea of this saw is that the blade itself is curved so that you're only ever cutting at the crown of that curve. So it's great for little brace work situations where you're trying to cut something close to the soundboard but without accidentally digging into the soundboard with the saw itself. Something like this, it would be very easy to mar other parts of the soundboard while you're cutting. But here we're not doing that. I think you get a certain amount of control that's really nice from not having all of the teeth engage with the wood all at once. Don't get me wrong, this works almost as good as this. This is just a marginal. This is what I reach for without even thinking about it, okay? This is what my gut tells me to use. So if you don't have it, don't worry about it. Now you want to, clamp this down somehow. I always clamp it right on the template, just because that gives me, why not? It gives me a little extra grab there. And then I'm just going to take my saw and hold it right against my wedge template. Now, let's say you didn't even have a Dozuki saw, a dovetail saw. A dovetail saw works fine for this. It's a little big. I prefer to use a nice small saw like this, but it works. This is a very thick piece of wood. The saw is not as dull as it seems, it's just a thick piece of wood. There we go. And we're through. And now I'm going to do the same thing, same cut on the other side. And we have one piece. So now I can take my strip, and I don't have to line it up on center again like I was just explaining. I can just line up. I already have a perfect edge that matches up with the shape of my wedge here. I can just line up that edge, especially if I use a piece of wood like the piece I just cut out. I can use that to butt it up perfectly against the edge. Retighten this down, and then just make one cut on the other side. I don't have to do the two cuts every time now because I already have a nice, perfect mating edge. Now again, if I was really picky about having the grain be dead center with the center line every time, then I would realign with the grain, which I can see the grain is turning like this right now. I would realign with the grain, and I'd have to make the two cuts on each side. But I'm going to let the grain wander a little bit to give it some character. Okay, so that's lined up nicely. Alright, two down, so you can see where I'm going with this. Right? I got my triangle shaped wedges. I'm just going to keep producing more, and then we'll glue them all together. Now here, for example, in the center of this strip, the grain has actually shifted so much that I would have a very sort of rift-sawn looking piece if I continued to do what I was doing. So I am actually reorienting with the grain. And you can see how much I have to turn that to get it back in line with the grain. And so that'll produce a little more waste. I might still be able to get a piece out of this side, but that might just be waste, which is fine. I've got more wood to work with. Again, I don't need to perfectly follow the grain, but if it really starts to turn on me, it just becomes an aesthetic judgment. Am I okay with that? I don't think perfection, having it perfectly on the grain, looks particularly good, but if it's really turning away from you, that also doesn't look good. A judgment call, as always. Okay, so I cut all 12 pieces. I actually ended up cutting a couple extra pieces just so that I had something to play with as far as aesthetically moving these around. I booted these two out because I just didn't like the way the grain was. And now if I want to, I can reassemble these until I just kind of like the way it looks. I don't have to do that, but for example, there's too many sort of reddish, orangish colored ones over here. And so I'm just gonna move some of them around so it looks a little more random. And then the other thing to decide is there's going to be a portion that's going to be covered by the fretboard tongue. One piece will be covered completely by the fretboard tongue and kind of a small part of the adjacent pieces. So you can put your worst pieces up there. They won't be seen. Alright, now let's shift gears here. We can take the wedge template off and get it out of the way. And we're also going to take the circle clamp off for a moment. And that is just to stick down, or not stick down because it's not adhesive backed or anything. We're just going to put down, lay down some wax paper. Alright, so about that much, just enough to cover the surface. And this is because we're going to be gluing right onto the surface, and we don't want to stick our rosette down to the jig, right? Now we can put our circle clamp back on. These little screws I'll just puncture down through the wax paper. Okay, and we can leave that loose for now. Oh, I almost forgot. We need to put paste wax on the circle clamp itself. So let me take this off again. So this surface right here, yeah, you could put another smaller piece of wax paper. Don't do that though. It's just going to be too difficult to assemble the pieces with these flaps of wax paper everywhere. So what I do is wax paper on the surface and paste wax on the clamp itself. Now alternatively, you could do paste wax all over the surface, but again, I think that has its cons as well. It's just too messy. So I carry both. I carry wax paper and I carry paste wax. They do the same thing though. They both keep glue from sticking. Alright, there's my paste wax. Alright, and let's start assembling. And at the same time as assembly, I'm also going to be fine-tuning the fit of these pieces against each other. So what I'm going to do, it's very simple, you know, everything you have is right at hand. The right tool for the job often is the one that's closest to you. So I just use the same block that I used to cut the pieces on, and we're going to make our own little mini shooting board off of this block simply by clamping it to the table like so. And then I'll take my first piece and let's see which plane I want to use here. I think this one is set up for how I want it to be set up right now. Yeah, that's great. And so, like a mini shooting board, I'm going to take my individual piece, butt it up against the clamp. The clamp itself is like my backstop. And then I can just clean up that edge with a plane. So the reason this is necessary, or likely necessary, is because when we cut this with the saw, in theory it's possible that you can cut them and the edge will just be perfectly square and clean, perfectly square and clean. But in reality, that's rarely the case, because what can and often will happen is, one, it just might not be a clean surface, so you want to clean that up. But also, as I'm making this cut, even though I'm holding it against the template, there's a good chance I might be angling just slightly in the vertical realm. And so if we have an angle there, then when we push these together, you're going to see a gap, right? So it's really just the ideal world versus the real world, and the real world always wins. So we're just cleaning that up. Even just a single pass sometimes is all it needs. I took a couple passes there. Okay, so I cleaned up both sides. And now I can do the same with the adjoining piece. As always, don't be sloppy with your plane work. Firm start and a firm stop even. None of this swooping in, follow through kind of action. Nice firm movements. And then I can see now as I assemble this that it's gap free. So that looks good. Now I'm going to take either one of my pieces or even just a scrap piece. Actually, I'll take one of these, one of these small scrap pieces. And I'm just using it to prop up the other side of this clamp. Okay, this is going to go away in the end. I just need something to hold this propped up while I do my work. And so I'm going to shift these around until it lines up with the lines on the jig. And that looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead, tighten this down. You can hear my rooster just going apeshit out there. I don't know what he's doing. Maybe he sees something, a hawk, or maybe he's just having fun. Okay, water thin CA glue, accelerator. We're going to go ahead and glue the first piece, because now at this point we just glue these as we go. I'm going to move this over so you can see everything. Okay, now I'm just going to go on down the line, cleaning this up as I go. So that's cleaned up. Now doing this serves another function as well. As I go, I might notice, actually this still looks perfect right now, but I might notice that I place this in here, and on this side I'm starting to drift off of these lines here, these nice even lines that I have laid out. And so in that case, I'll take this and I can adjust that angle on that edge to true that up with the line again. At this point, that still looks good though, so all I have to do is slide this under the clamp and glue it. Still right on my lines. No adjustment necessary. A little bit of extra glue on that one. Okay, still on the lines. This is actually rare that it's going quite well. Often there is a little bit of drift. I think it's because I started using the saw, actually. This does seem to cut more accurately than using a larger Suzuki saw. So perhaps I'm just seeing the fruits of that decision to switch to that saw. All right, wonderful. This one is just a hair off the line, so I'm going to adjust that angle with the plane. So I want the angle to go more in this direction. Essentially, I want it to be a little bit more obtuse. So I'm going to take a little bit off of the front edge to set the new angle and then walk that back. So first you take some excess material off the one side to set the angle, and then once that's set you can start to walk that back, okay? I hope that makes sense. And that is how you can fix that as you go. If that is too tricky for you, you can do the same thing on a sanding board like I have over there. And with selective pressure, just put a little pressure on the end where you want to remove the material. And now that's spot on, just like that. Okay. Now instead of continuing around this way, I always like to do the hidden joint, which is going to be right up here. This is what's going to be covered by the fretboard tongue. That's my ugliest joint. It can be my ugliest joint. I'll do that last. And that's because with when I wrap all the way around the end, it's very likely that that last piece, I'm going to have to adjust the angle a little bit more than the other ones to make it fit. And if anything's going to look a little wonky or a little noticeably smaller or bigger than the other pieces, it's going to be that last connecting piece. Now, you might think, oh, I'll just wrap all the way around and I don't even need that last piece because, like Eric said, it's going to be completely covered by the fretboard tongue. However, because we have to cut this out with the Dremel and then handle it and get it into place, I always recommend closing the loop completely because the rigidity that you get from a closed loop will make it way stronger in cutting it out and handling it and all of that. So yeah, you definitely still want to connect it and close that loop. All right, so now we're going to start working around this way, so I'll take this piece. All right, so now I'm going to do the last two pieces, and I can pull out this little spacer piece that we were just temporarily using to hold up the other side of the clamp, because now all of this is holding it up. And we're going to handle these last two pieces Now this last piece is always going to fit just because of compounding error as you wrap around. It's always going to, well, put it this way, I would be very pleasantly shocked if you put this last piece in and it just magically made it up perfectly with the edge here. But you can see, or maybe you can't, I know the camera's a little far up there, maybe I'll zoom in for this, but you can see this has some wobble to it. So all that means is this last piece, we're going to, just by eye and by hand, correct that until it wedges in as nicely as we can get it. So I'm going to put this in here and just adjust my angle until we don't have that wobble. That's pretty good. I actually overcompensated a little bit, and now the wobble is in the front, whereas before it was in the back. So let me just fix that. There we go. Now that's perfect. That's really tight. Which at this point, because I know this is where we're going to be under the fretboard tongue, the purpose of it being really tight is just to have a nice, rigid, strong rosette that's not going to fall apart in my hands. It's not really for aesthetics like the other joints are. And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. All right. So next, we're going to route this thing out. In order to know where to make our two routes to cut out the ring, we need to know a couple things here. So I'm going to measure from the pin out to my sound hole edge so I can see that that is at 41.5 millimeters. And then a typical rosette, not all of course because it's just aesthetic, but very commonly a rosette begins about 3 millimeters, sometimes a little bit more, from the sound hole edge. But 3 millimeters is a good, useful number to keep in your head. And so just to show you what that looks like, so about that distance, so that you have enough distance from the rosette to the edge that you can see the spruce and see the grain in the spruce and everything before it meets the abyss of the sound hole. And then the actual width of your rosette can be whatever. It's whatever you want it to be. I will say I have noticed both in my own work and in other people who start doing radial rosettes that everyone seems to start out by doing these super huge radial rosettes. I think because we become a little enamored with the wood itself. And over time, at least for me, they tend to get a little bit smaller because I think that is just a more tasteful looking rosette. Okay, so you can make these too big to the point where they're a little bit obnoxious. But again, you can do whatever you want. We'll go ahead and first mark out the inside edge of our rosette. So that would be the distance from the pin to the sound hole plus that 3 millimeters. So that puts us at about 50, maybe 50.5. I'm going to do 50.5. And then for the outside edge, again, I can do whatever. I usually just kind of eyeball this. So if I look at the material, I can judge by looking at the grain what's going to look good. And I'm going to say 12 millimeters from that first line. So it'll be a 12 millimeter thick, or wide I should say, rosette. Yeah, maybe I'll make it a little bit bigger. This is all a part of the fun. You judge things, then you doubt yourself. That's 14 millimeters. Yeah, I think that's good. Now, we want to load this up. And I'm going to slide this over here just so my cord isn't stretching out so far. And I'll take the camera over with me in a second. Alright, so now I'm going to drop this down, bottom out the Dremel a little bit, or close to bottomed out, so that I can see where I'm going, and I'm going to adjust this until I'm right on my outside line. Now this is a kind of comical mistake to make, not for you, but for anybody else who watches you do it. But it's very common too. If you cut the inside first, if you make that inside cut first, what you might not realize is that you have now separated yourself from the thing that's holding the whole thing down, which is the circle clamp. Okay? That's if you make the inside cut first. Don't do that. You make the outside cut first, because you're still connected then by the circle clamp, and then you make the inside cut last, so that as you make your final pass, you're separating the piece from the clamp. Because hey, once you separate the piece from the clamp, then there's no way to keep this whole thing steady and to get a perfect circle when you route if it's not being held down. And now we're gonna make this route down to its full depth, but we're not going to do that all in one pass. I'm going to do that in several passes. So we'll bottom this out first, like that. And then using the little depth setting thingy here, I can take a feeler gauge. I keep this 12 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge that I use for all kinds of things like this. 12 thousandths of an inch sounds like it's a very shallow depth, but it actually ends up being quite a bit deeper, probably more like 20 thousandths of an inch, because you have to trap the feeler gauge and then loosen it just enough to pull the feeler gauge out. And so I find that using a 12 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge seems to get you about the right depth every time. Doesn't have to be that precise. You know, it could be a 14 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge or just something in the low teens. And there we go. Set the next depth. Okay, and now I'm going to adjust this to the inside cut, make that cut, and we will have our rosette. Okay, there it is. So this is very fragile, but it's there. And what I'm going to do next is install this into the soundboard, and I'm going to go ahead and do this off camera just so I can get it done. And hey, it's really no different if you can install a normal rosette, whatever normal means in that case. If you can install any kind of rosette into your soundboard, you can install this. So basically just going to trace out the footprint of the rosette there, and then at the center of that footprint I'm going to route all the way down to my depth, the depth of the rosette, or at least how far down I want the rosette to be embedded. And then because the size of that bit is much smaller than the width of the rosette, I'm going to continuously adjust the radius until I widen it enough to reach both my inner and my outer traced line for the rosette. Okay, as I get really close, and this is very important, I'm not just going to blindly go straight to my lines. As I get really close to those lines, then I'm going to start checking the fit, because I want to just sneak up on it, do a pass, check it, okay, still too tight, do another pass with the router, adjusting the radius, check it again until it finally goes in. And then I'm going to glue it in with Titebond. I don't like to use cyanoacrylate or super glue here for the rosette because it has a tendency to stain deeply into the spruce. If you're really careful with it, you can get away with it, but you're kind of running a pretty serious risk there. So I like to use Titebond. The only thing to worry about with Titebond is that it swells the fibers of the wood. And so if you have a perfectly tight fit where the rosette just barely presses into place, and then you add your glue, that water-based glue, Titebond, it's water-based, is going to swell the fibers and make your channel slightly smaller. And now you're in a really panicky situation where you're trying to fit your rosette and the channel has actually closed up slightly and you can't fit the rosette. So keeping that in mind, you want to always leave, if you're gluing with water-based glue like Titebond, you want to always make sure you're not a perfectly tight fit. You want to be just a hair loose. It shouldn't be visibly loose like it's just playing around in there, but it shouldn't also be a press fit. Okay, and I think that covers that whole operation there just verbally in words. And I will see you guys when this is done just to show you the final product. All right, folks, so this is all glued up. And now I am just using a thumb plane to trim it down so we can take a look at what it looks like. If you recall, the material that I started with was very thick, so I installed this leaving it very, very proud. So we've got a lot to trim through, but there was no particular reason for that, by the way. It can be a lot thinner, and in some ways that makes it easier. Honestly, I just didn't feel like thicknessing this small piece of wood, and I knew, hey, you can just thickness it, which is essentially what I'm doing now. You can thickness it after it's installed, and it's a little bit easier sometimes. But hey, this is looking pretty good. Not there yet, but you can see that's coming together. That is almost flush, and actually almost flush is what I want, because hey, this guitar has a long way to go to be completed, and there's plenty of opportunities to be sanding on here, especially when we have the binding installed, and we don't want to overly thin the top, so there's no reason to get this perfectly flush right now, just workably flush. And what I mean by workably flush is I can barely feel it there, so that means it's not gonna get in my way when I'm flipping this over and gluing down all these braces, or get in my way when I put the circle cutting jig that I just had on here, when I put it back on and cut out the sound hole itself. I want the rosette to be out of the way for that. Okay, so I think that's good. I'm going to put this on the shelf so it's ready for the class. And I want to thank you guys for tuning in. And don't forget what I said about that one class, $300 off of a workshop. I've literally never done that before, by the way, because I haven't been desperate and been that desperate to fill a spot. And I really want to fill that spot. So, $300 off. That's March 8th. And also, because I like selling things, I'll keep selling you guys things. If you liked what you saw here, you can go ahead on my website and buy a Radial Rosette Maker jig. Okay, guys. I had fun. I hope you guys did too. Bye for now. If you learned something here, please give this video a like and subscribe so you can be notified when I release a new DIY guitar making video. And if you want to really learn more, take one of my structured online courses at ericschaferguitars.com or register for a hands-on guitar building workshop here with me in Burnville, Pennsylvania.